2.12 trillion rupees, that is the massive, record-breaking number we're looking at today. It actually represents the largest federal budget in Nepal's history for the fiscal year 2083/84. But what does a number that big actually mean for the country's future? And, probably more importantly, what does it mean for your own wallet?
Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to unpack the government's really bold economic promises and compare them directly with the cold, hard fiscal data. We've got a fascinating tension here. On one hand, you have a budget framed around massive tax relief and futuristic technological growth. But on the other hand, it's set against this stark reality of record-breaking deficits and heavy domestic borrowing. Our goal right now is just to break down all these dense financial documents into clear, digestible insights.
So here is our roadmap for today. First, the biggest budget ever. Second, taxes in your wallet. Third, where the money actually goes. Fourth, the bold tech agenda. And fifth, we'll wrap up with the expert verdict. Let's just dive right in.
Section 1. The biggest budget ever and setting the scale.
Finance Minister Dr. Swarnamwagal didn't just present a slightly larger fiscal plan. This budget is a staggering 25% larger than the previous year's revised estimate. And honestly, the ambition completely matches the size. The government is targeting a massive 7% real GDP growth for the year, with this grand vision of building a production-based $100 billion economy within just 7 years. To put that into perspective, Nepal has recently been trending around 4 to 5% growth, so jumping up to 7% is an incredibly aggressive target. It relies heavily on a sudden, major revival of private investment. But how exactly does the government plan to stimulate that investment? Well, that brings us to the most immediate change for most of us.
Moving on to Section 2, taxes and your wallet, or basically, what this means for you.
The finance minister paired this massive spending plan with arguably the most substantive tax structure overhaul we've seen in recent years. If you're a working professional, listen up, because the immediate benefit here is huge. The tax-exempt income threshold has been completely doubled. It's now set at 10 lakh rupees. That means your first 10 lakh of income is effectively shielded from standard income tax, barring that 1% social security tax for non-contributors. For a massive chunk of the middle class, this is a direct, really substantial boost to your take-home pay.
And it doesn't stop at the bottom brackets. The government actually slashed the top marginal personal income tax rate from a steep 39% all the way down to 29%. Plus, they've totally simplified the structure. Those old, confusing separate slabs for individuals and couples, they've been merged into a single unified set of brackets. It's a very deliberate pro-investment move designed to leave way more capital in the hands of individuals and business owners.
For businesses and everyday consumers, the simplifications keep rolling. The government compressed customs tariffs from 11 bans down to just 7. Even more remarkably, they completely removed excise duties on 360 everyday items. This is explicitly designed to lower both manufacturing costs and consumer prices. Oh, and if you pay digitally and get a simultaneous invoice, you now get a 10% VAT rebate. It's a super smart nudge to help formalize the digital economy.
Section 3. Where the money goes. Let's split the rupee.
You're probably wondering, how do you actually pay for the largest budget in the country's history if you're slashing personal income taxes, cutting customs, and abolishing excise duties on hundreds of items? Where does the cash come from? Well, despite all the announcements about merging and cutting ministries to save money, nearly 60% of this massive budget, 59.8% to be exact, is still eaten up by recurrent spending. That's just the day-to-day cost of keeping the lights on: government salaries, pensions, administrative overhead. Only 20.3% is dedicated to capital expenditure, which is the money used to actually build the physical future of the country. And another 19.9% goes straight to financing and paying off old debt. And of that capital and program spending, the money is flowing into very traditional sectors. Roads and urban infrastructure lead the pack with a massive 286.48 billion rupees. Education follows at 218.3 billion, and Social Security takes up 120 billion. So it's pretty clear that while the rhetoric of the budget is highly futuristic, the reality of the spending is incredibly focused on concrete, asphalt, and social safety nets.
So here is the catch, and it's a big one. Projected revenues simply do not cover this massive spending. That leaves a staggering 657.29 billion rupee deficit. To cover this huge gap, the government is leaning heavily into borrowing. What you really need to take away from this is that 410 billion rupees of this deficit will be funded through domestic borrowing. When the government borrows that heavily from local banks, it risks crowding out the private sector. It makes it way harder and more expensive for local businesses to get loans, which, if you think about it, creates a real tension with that 7% growth target we talked about earlier.
All right, Section 4.
The bold tech agenda. AI and the future.
If you just listened to the budget speech, you'd honestly think this was entirely a technology budget. The government painted this flashy, headline-grabbing vision of an AI-driven economic transformation. The flagship initiatives sound incredibly ambitious. A national sovereign AI compute center in Kathmandu, heavily subsidized computing power for local AI startups to keep all that talent in the country, in a major structural move with a 34% public divestment of Nepal Telecom, with the proceeds meant to turn Nepal into a literal tech hub. It sounds absolutely incredible, right? A massive leap into the 21st century.
But then you look at the actual funding, 0.28%. Out of a 2.12 trillion rupee budget, the total allocation for the entire information technology and communications sector is just 5.93 billion rupees. Independent analysts have been pretty blunt about this. As they put it, at 0.28% of outlay, the funding is an order of magnitude below the ambition. You simply cannot build a sovereign AI capability and subsidize a whole ecosystem of startups on less than 1/3 of 1% of the national budget. The data clearly shows that this digital transformation is mostly rhetoric and policy-led, rather than being backed by actual, hard fiscal spending. Which brings us to Section 5, the expert verdict, a public finance economist read. When independent public finance economists assess this historic budget, they offer a really polarized view. The tax policy? That's praised as genuinely strong. The threshold bumps and rate cuts are seen as brilliant simplifications for everyday citizens. Fiscal federalism is rated adequate, with fair transfers to local levels. But the expenditure structure remains mixed simply because recurrent, day-to-day spending still eats up nearly 60% of the pie. And the glaring red flags? Revenue realism and deficit and debt, which both score weak. Let's unpack those specific structural risks, because this matters. Expected revenue covers only 66.1% of the total planned spending. That leaves the government with the largest ever deficit to finance. Independent analysts point out that cutting income taxes and abolishing excises while simultaneously budgeting record-breaking spending is a massive gamble. If that highly ambitious 7% growth target disappoints, revenues will fall short, and all that massive domestic borrowing will just suffocate the private sector's access to credit. To mitigate these systemic risks, experts suggest 3 very clear steps for the government. First, publish a transparent medium-term debt sustainability path so citizens actually know how this record borrowing is going to be paid off. Second, release a static revenue loss estimate to show exactly how much money is being given up by the new tax cuts. And third, re-anchor the economic expectations to a more credible, realistic near-term growth target rather than relying on that hyper-optimistic 7% jump. So, we have seen some fantastic tax relief for everyday citizens, but it's juxtaposed against terrifyingly large deficit numbers and heavily underfunded tech promises. I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. Is the government's 7% growth target a realistic vision for a brand new economic era, or is it just a risky gamble built entirely on borrowed money? Thank you so much for exploring the numbers with me on this explainer today. Let me know what you think.